In Lisbon, the Spanish embassy goes up in flames. This was the climax of a day of left-wing protests against the execution of 5 urban guerrillas in neighboring Spain. Portuguese police stood by as the demonstrators sacked the building, throwing furniture and files through the windows onto the bonfires below. The embassy was completely ruined. Lisbon's was the most dramatic protest against the executions, but it was by no means the only one. All over Europe, demonstrators took to the streets. In Rome, they called for a boycott of Spanish trade and communications with Italy. In Paris, they turned out in their hundreds with photo placards of the dead men to march down the Champs-Élysées. Later, the protest became a riot as Spanish-owned property came under attack. And in London, the Spanish embassy was besieged by a large crowd whose banners and slogans expressed fierce anti-Franco feelings. There were similar demonstrations in other capitals, and altogether, 15 European countries recalled their ambassadors from Madrid. By contrast, the Spanish capital remained calm as Spaniards tried to evaluate what the executions meant for the future of their country. 3 of the guerrillas were members of an illegal Maoist party called FRAP, the Patriotic Revolutionary Anti-Fascist Front. The other 2 were members of the Basque terrorist group ETA. All of them had been found guilty of murdering policemen. The first public demonstration in Madrid came 5 days after the executions, in a massive pro-government rally in front of the Royal Palace. Well over 100,000 people turned out to hear General Franco himself, in a rare personal appearance, blame a Masonic conspiracy and communist subversion for Spain's growing unrest. Only hours before the rally, 3 more policemen were shot to death in what everyone assumed were terrorist reprisals for the executions. For General Franco, the trend towards increasing violence during the past 18 months is perhaps the most obvious sign of the country's frustrations. He's been dictator of Spain for nearly 40 years, ever since he emerged victorious from a civil war whose horrors still scar the memories of the older generation of Spaniards. His power came not from the ballot box, but from the army, with the support of the church. Now, at 82, he's visibly ill, and many think too old to control events. And though he hasn't changed, the country he rules most certainly has. In the last decade, Spain's economic growth has been second only to Japan's. The tourist boom of the 60s made Spain an industrial power. Huge sums of foreign exchange have fueled the expansion of industry, which in turn has created a substantial middle class with a reasonable level of prosperity. The average income of the Spanish worker has gone up 6-fold in the last 20 years. The economic transformation may have made life more comfortable, but it hasn't made it politically meaningful. Spain's political development has lagged far behind the economy. The Cortes, the Spanish parliament, has close on 600 members, but less than 1/5 of them are directly elected by ordinary citizens. Franco remains the sole arbiter of political affairs, and deputies do little more than confirm his decisions.
Nada debe al pasado. Nace de aquel acto decisivo del 18 de julio
It's perhaps not surprising that those who lived through the terrible sufferings of the Civil War should have been willing to let Franco create law and order on his own terms. At that time, peace in exchange for some democratic rights must have seemed an appealing proposition. But today, 2/3 of Spain's population are under 35. They were no part of the war, and their aspirations are not limited by the experience of their parents. It's among them that demands for political change are strongest, and in recent years, those demands have brought them into conflict with the government. Throughout 1972, agitation at Madrid University led to many clashes between students and police. For a time, the university was closed, and a police garrison was stationed on the campus. Another discontented group lived in the northeast, bordering the Pyrenees. 2 million Basques who consider themselves to be neither French nor Spanish. They have their own culture and traditions, as well as a language unintelligible to most Spaniards. The Basques have long campaigned for more independence from Madrid, and in recent years, a militant Marxist group called ETA has fought with guns and bombs for total separation. By 1973, the strains on the Franco system were becoming alarmingly obvious, and liberals hoped that even if the Caudillo refused to recognize them, old age would compel him to step down from power. In fact, Franco did give up the post of Prime Minister, though this hardly altered the complexion of the government. The new premier was Admiral Luis Carrero Blanco, a lifelong comrade in arms, whose only philosophy of government was unquestioning loyalty to his leader. Carrero Blanco's government lasted barely 6 months. In December 1973, he was assassinated when a bomb blew his car 60 feet into the air in a Madrid street. The man accused of this crime, a Basque separatist, will be tried in the next few months. Carrero Blanco's successor was a civilian, Carlos Arias Navarro, who surprised many people by cautiously introducing more liberal measures. He even put forward a plan that would eventually have allowed political parties to develop, but right-wingers in the government voted it down. Another personality in whom liberals put some hope is Prince Juan Carlos, Franco's own hand-picked heir and successor. He's the grandson of Spain's last king, Alfonso XIII, and will officially assume the throne himself when Franco dies or retires as head of state. Many people thought that day of succession had finally arrived when, in July last year, Franco entered hospital with a severe attack of phlebitis, an illness that forced him to hand over, temporarily, his powers as head of state. For 2 months, Juan Carlos played the part and seemed to enjoy it, and it was generally believed that even if Franco recovered, he would take the opportunity to retire and so ensure a gradual and peaceful transition to the post-Franco era after all. But that particular scenario was soon set aside. On leaving hospital, the aging leader took back all his powers. That decision was a breaking point for the government's most militant opponents. 10 days later, a bomb wrecked this restaurant next to Madrid's police headquarters. It killed 11 people. A new wave of violence and terrorism had begun, and with it went the last hopes that the Arias government would be able to guide Spain towards a more democratic future. Opposition to Franco wasn't confined to extreme organizations. Last winter, thousands of workers came out on strike in the mines, transport and the docks, and left-wing representation in labor organizations increased substantially. In the Basque region, support increased for both the moderate Basque National Party and the ETA guerrillas, especially after a state of emergency was imposed on the Basque provinces in April this year. This meant that police and civil guards could hold hundreds of suspects on the flimsiest of evidence. Violence provoked counter-violence. After 9 members of the security forces had been killed, the government decreed an anti-terrorist law in August. It gave the police sweeping powers and made the death penalty mandatory for murders of policemen. It was under this law that 2 Basques were sentenced to death, even though lawyers maintained that one of them was unfit to plead because of brain damage suffered while resisting arrest. Basques in Bayonne, over the border in France, were among the first to protest at this treatment. Other protests against government intransigence came from the church. Earlier this year, Spain's Roman Catholic bishops called for civil rights, national reconciliation, and an end to the animosities of the Civil War. It was their first collective pastoral letter since they declared their support for General Franco's nationalists in 1937. And after the trial verdicts, the Pope himself appealed for clemency directly to Franco no fewer than 3 times. In San Sebastian, the heartland of the Basque region, public reaction to the executions was expressed quietly. Shops closed for 2 days and the fishing fleet stayed in port, even though traders faced heavy fines if they refused to open when ordered to. The civil guard, generally hostile to photographers, were much in evidence, as indeed they were in the outlying villages. Here at Urrieta, in the foothills of the Pyrenees, the annual tug-of-war championships went ahead unaffected. Watching the contest, the Civil Guard. All of them are strangers to the area, and they've recently been issued with submachine guns. Not that every Basque here or in San Sebastian is an ETA sympathizer. For many, the organization's methods are too extreme. It's believed another 20 prisoners could be brought before the emergency courts in the next few weeks. Most of the defense lawyers have protested that the time and facilities given to them simply don't allow them to prepare any kind of sensible case. One lawyer involved in the case of the executed men was Jose Folguera. He told us of his experience.
First of all, our clients knew about the trial the day before. We went to the prison and tried to prepare defense with them. But they had in that very moment been deprived of any sort of paper and notes and all this, and had been taken away into a sort of isolating cell with no possibility to help us. The following day, during the trial, we remarked this and asked for a suspension, which we didn't get. Then, previously we had I had myself asked for some 27 matters of evidence, of which 27 or 26 were witnesses, and some of them 4 or 5 eyewitnesses. But they have denied them.
There are several more men held in prison in Spain at the moment who could face the death penalty. Would you expect in the present climate that there will be more executions or not?
I certainly hope that this would be quite enough that official expressions of restoring order and all this, that effectively order has been restored in this country. I hope so, because otherwise I don't know what could be the number of these executions. If the same criteria applied today are applied to further trials, the number of execution is going to go quite very high.
In the last analysis, General Franco's power rests on the army, an institution which he created and which has remained steadfastly loyal to him in the years since the Civil War. But now, as political opinion in Spain shows signs of polarizing, worried brigadiers and generals are reported to be consulting on how best to secure the post-Franco era. A coup against their leader still seems unthinkable, but military pressure to democratize Spain may not be, especially if a majority of officers become convinced that without such liberalization, General Franco's regime is more likely to end as it began, in violence and bloodshed.